Hi everyone. So for this video, what we're going to try to do is we're going to try to give just like an introduction to early modern philosophy. What are we studying? Why are we studying this specific period over other periods? And so on. Just to get started, really when we're talking about early modern philosophy, we're talking more or less about philosophy that takes place between the 17th and 18th centuries. Specifically, what people often have in mind whenever they talk about early modern philosophy is they have a sequence of philosophical authors that are sort of generally viewed to be in conversation with one another that begins with Descartes and ends with Immanuel Kant. And we're going to talk about the specifics of this timeline in a moment. But what's very interesting about this is the amount of widespread agreement that there actually is in the discipline about the specific historical periodization. If you get into sort of like historical categories, about ways to think about philosophical periods of philosophy, typically they will be very, very controversial. So, just as an example, even just to talk about a grouping of philosophy as like pre Socratic philosophy, so just philosophy prior to Socrates, that is like a very complex sort of historical periodization. People don't agree about how far it goes, whether the category is even useful, and so on. And the more that you study sort of like any area of philosophy, the more that you'll find this is the case. Just to give a couple more examples, if you are thinking about like existentialism as a philosophical tradition, then who gets included in that, whether it's a really coherent category, whether it's right to group a bunch of people or only put people that actually consider themselves to be existentialists in that category, that is very rough. Like those are very contentious debates, and it can get really messy between people. Another one is people talking about post-structuralism or postmodernism. Like, what are those categories? Who is included? Is it like an agreement about a philosophical thesis? Like, what is that? So that's just to say that all ways of like thinking about the periodization of philosophy, and those examples are all just in Western philosophy, let alone to talk about the engagement between different philosophical cultures, even to discuss what makes a single sort of like culture or tradition or period is something very, very fraught and that philosophers love to fight and argue about. But despite that, people more or less agree that early modern philosophy is a thing, and early modern philosophy is defined as the specific European philosophical tradition that moves from Descartes and goes into Kant. Now, something that might be a little bit more of a controversial characterization of early modern philosophy, but one that is going to be of fundamental importance for how we think about this class, is that early modern philosophy is sort of like paradigmatically thinking about three different kinds of topics. Thinking about metaphysics, so what is the nature of ultimate reality, right? What at the base level, is everything made of, right? What is the underlying substance of the world? Questions like that, right? Epistemology, which are questions about what it is that we can know and how it is that we can come to know it. So the early modern tradition is really investigating and questioning, like, what are the sorts of things that we learn from the senses versus what are the sorts of things that we can know just purely through rational reasoning and reflection. What are the sources of our knowledge and how far does that knowledge go? These are paramount questions for the early modern tradition. And then finally, the third theme that we're really going to focus on for this course is called philosophy of mind. And so what that means is when we're talking about agents, not just like our bodies, but like when we make judgments, whenever we decide things, whenever we treat each other as people, right? We think about each other as minded agents. So the basic question of philosophy of mind is what is that stuff, right? Are we talking about a very complex physical system? Is the mind something that's not physical, right? What is the relationship between the mind and the body, right? Basically trying to figure out like how do we conceive of ourselves as agents or as minds, as thinking things, and how does that relate to the fact that we're also embodied beings, right? That we exist in a particular space and time, that we exist in a body, and so on, right? And so these are the three sort of paramount themes that we're going to be thinking about in this class and thinking about these as essential to the early modern tradition. And those are, again, just metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind, right? So if metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind are sort of like the primary topics discussed within early modern philosophy. You know, you might still think a couple things. One of them is that, of course, there are early modern reflections on other philosophical topics, right? Like Descartes wrote a lot about ethics, for example, right? What is the proper approach to the passions that you feel in life where you're affected by the world? How do you manage that? And what does that mean for a rational being? Descartes did think about these questions. And in fact, basically all of the early modern philosophers that we're considering did have reflections at an ethical or political register. However, chiefly the way that people ordinarily think about the early modern tradition is being as centrally concerned with the topics in metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind. Usually, where we think about the importance of these figures as ethical or political thinkers, a lot of the time we think about that as sort of like a downstream consequence of their insights at the level of metaphysics and epistemology. And of course, it's not to say that there aren't a lot of very important thinkers politically in this tradition, right? I mean, of course, John Locke is well known for sort of providing the foundations of the United States Constitution, right? So he's obviously a very influential liberal political thinker. Rousseau is another philosopher who, unfortunately, we don't read for this class, but is in this time period and was heavily influential on the French Revolution and sort of developing the liberal tradition. And then, of course, there's Kant himself, right, who's well known for sort of being an influence on cosmopolitan and liberal political traditions around the world. I mean, he's often cited as one of the models for the League of Nations, which was the first iteration of the United Nations. So there are important political thinkers here, right? But it's just not what we're focusing on for this specific course. And part of the reason why is because there's another course at the 300 level that covers classical social and political philosophy. And so you would hear these dimensions of these thinkers typically in that class. So just to think about early modern philosophy is generally to think about, the sort of metaphysical and epistemological topics discussed earlier. But you might also think like, well, if you've taken, say, Indian philosophy or Chinese philosophy or even ancient Greek philosophy, you might say, well, these traditions are also clearly very concerned with questions about metaphysics, epistemology, and philosophy of mind, even if they pose those problems in a somewhat different register, right? So why is it that we think about specifically this early modern European tradition as being especially important for the history of philosophy? Like I mentioned, almost every contemporary discussion of philosophical problems largely will see itself as a response to this philosophical tradition that I've written up here. And I know that my handwriting can be a little messy, so I'll be sure to go along and read out each individual entry on the timelines that I've written out here. But that's just to say that, this tradition is seen as especially important. Why? Right? Why specifically the 17th and 18th century instead of in Europe instead of the 6th and 7th century in Asia, for example? Like why do we think about this tradition as being centrally important now? Well, so basically, what I would like for this introduction is to be an explanation for why we consider this tradition to be so vitally important for contemporary philosophical problems. And the way that I would pose that is that it's not that, obviously Europe produced better intellectuals or something like that. Instead, the reason why we think a lot about this specific tradition in philosophy is because the problems posed to them are still in many ways the same problems that are posed to us. Specifically, what I mean is that these thinkers have had to sort of tarry with the development of a modern scientific method and worldview, right? That is ultimately what makes this tradition so rich and philosophically interesting, is that on the one hand, these philosophers are thinking about a scientific tradition, but they're also thinking about and engaged in a sort of Christian, typically Christian, but sometimes Judeo-Christian tradition, right? And so these philosophers are sort of at the advent of modern science and considering the implications of modern science for philosophy as a method. So, just as one example, um, I've written out here 3 concurrent timelines in philosophy, science, and religion that roughly go from the year 1500 to the year 1800. And so obviously, this is very cursory. This provides merely an outline of the events of these centuries in Europe, right? But I just want to highlight some specific events so that we can sort of begin to understand the historical context in which the philosophy that we're reading really takes place. So at the level of religion, in 1517, you have Martin Luther's 95 Theses. So this is a criticism of existing religious institutions, right? And this results in 1520 in his excommunication, right? From the Catholic tradition and the beginning of sort of the Protestant Reformation, right, happens now. You also get some of the first translation of the Bible, right, from the sort of ancient Greek that only a very, very select few members of the population could actually read, right, to the translation into a popular vernacular, right? People are able to read and engage with the Bible themselves, right? And so this is really the beginning of a sort of challenge to religious authority that's going to take place throughout the entirety of the sequence of figures that we're going to be discussing. And religious authorities often responded in turn, right? So in Martin Luther's case, he was excommunicated, right? He was, I think, also condemned by the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, right? Similarly, so that's the early 1500s in the religious sphere, right? And then in the scientific sphere, you start to see challenges to religion as well, right? In this case, in 1543, Copernicus published his findings on the movements of the planets, right? And he puts forward the thesis not that the sun revolves around the earth, but that the earth revolves around the sun. So this is his heliocentric theory of the solar system, right? And now from a modern tradition, it can be kind of hard for us to understand why this would be such a fundamental challenge to religion, right? And religious authority. But the crucial thing is that a lot of our scientific image of the universe at this period of the time come from religious institutions, right? So part of the reason for why the sun must orbit the earth rather than vice versa, right, is because God would create human beings at the center of the universe, right? This is an important part of Christian ideology at the time. And so Copernicus, simply by asserting what we now know to be a fact, namely that the earth orbits the sun, or point close to the sun, whatever, and vice rather than vice versa, is actually a challenge to the religious institution, precisely at a point where we don't really want to see any challenges, right? And so similarly, so that's Copernicus's heliocentrism. We don't really have many events I decided to list out here philosophically for now. We're going to see that philosophy has sort of like a delayed response to these kind of events, right? So to continue back to the bottom timeline here, in the year 1600, the philosopher Giordano Bruno was burned at the stake for his heterodox religious beliefs. So here again, we see, religious institutions turning against potential challengers, right? And so to turn back again to the sort of domain at the level of natural science around this time, in the 1610s, Galileo is developing sort of the foundations of his observational approach to astronomy, right? And eventually, he uses these sort of findings to kind of further justify the results, Copernicus's heliocentrism, right, that offered a challenge to religious institutions. So in 1632, Galileo himself is inquisitioned, right? He's put on house arrest, essentially. And this is after they burned Giordano Bruno to the stake and after they had excommunicated Martin Luther, right? So this is like a dangerous time, in short, to be a challenger either at the level of natural science or at the level of philosophy to these religious institutions. But at the same time, you really see science as a method come into its own, right? I've read here in 1620, Bacon, who we're going to be reading a little bit of, sort of develops the foundations of what we now would perhaps refer to as scientific method, right? And then similarly in 1637, Rene Descartes, actually, foundational philosopher that we're going to be reading, discovers analytic geometry. So, whenever you have like the XY axis, right, and you can chart algebraic expressions geometrically, right, that comes from Descartes, right? Okay, so this is a lot of events sort of at the level of institutions, religious institutions, and scientific findings, right, that inform this tradition of philosophy that comes up, right? 1641 is really where we think about the origin or beginning of the early modern tradition in Descartes' Meditations, which we're going to be reading in full next week. But really what you need to see here is just that what is happening is sort of like a reset at the level of philosophy. And what I mean by that is that Descartes is going to take on as an essential part of his method doubting the results of all prior philosophy and science in order to try to discover what are the things that I can know for certain, right? And I can know for certain through my own philosophical investigations, right? And so what this means is sort of like with natural science, right? He is questioning the dogma of religious authority, right? He's sort of claiming that like philosophy doesn't need to be led by theology, right? A lot of philosophical texts prior to Descartes sort of take the form of what is often called scholasticism, which is a tradition of philosophy that sort of tries to philosophically justify what they see as the philosophical commitments expressed in the Bible, right? And so there's a specific sort of yoking of philosophy to religious institutions prior to Descartes. Descartes says, philosophy can actually be more of a boon to religion by independently justifying its results, right? So instead of simply following the results of the Bible and being like, here's the philosophical justification for this or that, right? Descartes says, you'll have a better ability to combat challenges or atheism if you take them at their own terms. If you begin at the level of philosophical analysis and show that that concludes that Christianity or whatever is the best religion, right, that you could arrive at. Descartes himself was very sensitive to the fact that Bruno was burned at the stake, right, and Galileo was put on house arrest for his beliefs, right? Descartes himself was originally going to publish another work called The World before the Meditations, but whenever he saw the Inquisition of Galileo, he said, oh no, I need to rethink sort of how I'm approaching this so that the same thing doesn't happen to me, right? And so what's going on here is basically that modern scientific findings, and really this is just taking off, right? We're just getting observational astronomy, we're getting the foundations of scientific method, and then eventually later we're going to get Newtonian mechanics in 1687, right? And so we're really getting the beginnings of a modern scientific worldview, right? But that modern scientific worldview does not jive well with the religious, like specifically Judeo-Christian worldview, right? There are a number of ways that the modern scientific image sort of challenges religion, right? And the religious institutions have responded to that, namely by recognizing the challenge that they pose by arresting, imprisoning, killing, or excommunicating people that pose a significant challenge to that worldview that they think is so central to political institutions at the time, right? It's important that now we have the ability to sort of parse out these domains, right? Like we know that philosophy, science, and religion are all distinct, right? They offer, you go to learn about philosophy in a philosophy department, you go to learn about science in a science department, and so on, right? But at the time, right, many of these scientists simply called themselves natural philosophers, right? Because they're discovering what the nature of the natural world is, the created world, right? And oftentimes they thought that, this actually required some level of religious commitment, right? So like Newton, for example, was an ardent believer in God because he thought that God was necessary in order to make classical mechanics work, right? And so philosophers are put into this position where there's an emerging scientific worldview, right? There's an old religious worldview, and they seem to be increasingly coming into conflict with one another. And so what the philosopher attempts to do during this era is try to determine, based on their own reasoning, right, what aspects of the religious worldview are genuinely incompatible with natural science, right? And what elements of the natural scientific worldview have to be modified, adjusted, explained, grounded by certain metaphysical or religious commitments, right? And so philosophers sort of take themselves at this era to be mediators in the relationship between religion and natural science. And really, we're going to see philosophers take all sorts of different approaches here, right? Descartes, in large part, wants to say that the findings of the scientific worldview and the religious worldview can cohere together, right? If they're taken in a certain way, right? Whereas someone like Spinoza is going to argue that a lot of dimensions of our religious worldview had to be either extremely modified or abandoned entirely. That's a similar position given to someone like Hume, right? And so the reason why we continue to study early modern philosophy is that this problem of like there's an emerging scientific worldview, this emerging scientific worldview seems not to mesh well with our existing beliefs about reality. And so to what extent do we have to modify or adjust our, sort of like pre-scientific worldview, right? And while the philosophers that we examine essentially have to engage with this at the level of like physics and classical mechanics, right? Like, what does it mean that I can give a physical explanation for everything that the body does, right? What is the role played by the mind, right? Does the mind play any causal role in the workings of the body, right? These are the sorts of questions that early modern philosophers are thinking about, right? But even if you wanted to update the science and you wanted to say something like, how does our belief in a personal identity or freedom of the will or anything like that cohere with neuroscientific findings, right? That suggest that perhaps our cognitive processes are entirely reducible to the activities of neurons, right? Neurons and their interactions. That's all the mind is, right? If we accept that, what do we have to give up, right? Do we have to give up the idea of freedom, of responsibility, of our common folk language for talking about our own mindedness, right? And so, even though obviously early modern philosophers are dealing in their own specific context where they have their specific sort of like scientific framework that poses a challenge to them, specifically sort of like emerging Galilean and Newtonian models for astronomy and physics, right? And you also have a religious worldview or background that is maybe different from our own, right? But the way that we are like the early moderns is that we too have to reckon with the fact that there's an emerging scientific paradigm that grates against our current beliefs. And we now have to decide philosophically what stays and what goes, right? Okay, so now that I think that will suffice for now as sort of like a brief introduction to the period. I'd just like to take just a couple of moments to discuss the well, actually, I'll finish reading up the timeline and then I'll discuss a couple of readings that we had. So we got up to Descartes' Meditations, which are published in 1641. In general, the timeline for early modern philosophy is generally thought to be from Descartes' Meditations in 1641 to the publication of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in 1781. So that's like 150 years, essentially. Not that long, really. You see responses to things very quickly. So, like in 1641, you get Spinoza's Ethics already in 1677, right? And then Locke's Essays Concerning Human Understanding is 1689. Leibniz's Monadology is 1741. Hume's Essay is 1748. And Kant's Critique is 1781, right? So, and if you're not familiar with these texts, that's totally okay because those are just the main texts that we're going to be reading for this semester. This is just to offer you a little screenshot of like, wow, it's only a couple decades after Descartes' Meditations are published that we really get extremely complex, systematic responses, right? And so things happened very, very quickly in this period, right? And then, largely what happens after the publication of Descartes' Meditations at the level of scientific engagement is you get the foundations of Newtonian physics, right? That's really, you get that, and then you get calculus controversy between Newton and Leibniz. And then similarly at the level of sort of like religious and political institutions, you get a brief period in the 1740 to 1786 where Frederick the Great, he's like a king of Prussia, he was seen as sort of like an enlightenment figure, that he was like the enlightened despot king or whatever. And so like he was kind of like more okay with the independent discoveries of philosophers. And then after this, you get a lot of censorship again. And so this is sort of like a freer period for philosophy, specifically in Prussia. And then, sort of political event that you want to note, think about, is that sort of like right at the end of this tradition, 1789, we get the storming of the Bastille and the French Revolution, right? So this is sort of like the scientific and political context for a lot of these philosophical writings that we're going to be going through together. And for the first week, I had you read Michel de Montaigne's The Senses Are Inadequate and Immanuel Kant's What is Enlightenment. These are sort of like the beginning and the end of this tradition, where de Montaigne, excuse me, is sort of centrally concerned with epistemological questions, like what does it mean to know something, right? Can we genuinely say that things that we perceive are things that we know, and so on? These are sort of the questions that he wants to address. And he wants to say that the sort of knowledge that we can get from our senses is inadequate. It's imperfect in relation to the sort of knowledge that, say, God would have of things. Why? Well, we see things from like a certain specific perspective, right? I can only see objects that are so and so big, right? I can only see it at such and such a level of detail. If I look out into a horizon, I can only see for so far, right? My hearing is only so sensitive, right? And so the inadequacy of our sensory experience is just that it doesn't capture the way that the phenomena is in itself, right? And a lot of the modern tradition is going to be thinking about this, right? Thinking about what kinds of our knowledge claims are really adequate or perfect or, justificatory for the claims that we really think that they are, right? And then the Immanuel Kant, basically what Kant has to say is that enlightenment is the maturity to follow one's own reasoning, right? And so the reason why we characterize this specific period as being sort of like classical Enlightenment philosophy is because this is the first time philosophically that we really see the beginning of a philosophical tradition that is independent of organized religion, right? Unlike in the medieval era, theology and philosophy are not exactly identical anymore, right? Because theology is sort of like interpretation of holy texts, right? And philosophy is investigation into the fundamental nature of reality. And so, obviously, the opening of that distinction is to say that perhaps holy texts don't have the sort of authority that they've been taken to have, right? The details of Kant's account is about public and private freedom, for example. That is not as relevant to the specific concerns that we have for this class. The more important dimension for us is specifically thinking about the Enlightenment as sort of the emergence of reason, right? Specifically the emergence of philosophy to take itself on its own terms, right? To not be justified in virtue of the authority that someone has or whether or not it coheres exactly with existing religious institutions, but you have the beginning of philosophy being able to set its own terms and its own boundaries. And we're going to see that especially next week with Descartes. Sorry this week was so long. I appreciate you sticking with it to this extent. Obviously I wanted to be as thorough as possible explaining the syllabus and course proceedings, and I didn't want to have to rush through the introduction that I think is so helpful for knowing what's going on in this specific sort of period of philosophizing. So thank you, I appreciate it, and I'll see you next week. I look forward to reading your first week's reading responses.